the solution. I said a solution because it's individual. Everybody has their own set of experiences and contacts with people. I also wanted to know about, well, where is it? Where is racism in the locker room? Because there's some conflicting opinions about where it exists, how it exists, if it exists. So do we ignore it, disguise it, or just laugh about it? And then I'm asking the question today with my guest about how should teammates, and you can put it in a sports context if you want, or a business context as it relates to the word teammates, how should they be held accountable? And we'll have some examples of that with some sports references as well. But I want to make sure that you know today that we're talking about all kinds of different aspects of racism in the locker room, but it could be extended to other spaces. Like, for example, we have March Madness starts. Our mindset moment this week with Coach Wooden as the figurehead was this: don't let what you cannot do interfere with what you can do. Now, I have followed John Wooden when he was with us in the real-time flesh, and have continued to follow him since his passing after 90 plus years of being on this planet. And the one thing that I admired about him is his consistency in his behavior towards humanity. And that his wisdom wasn't about what you represented, but about what you did and how you did it. And so that seemed to be appropriate for our discussion today in our theme about locker room racists. Because look, listen, if you're a racist, just tell me. Just put it right there in front of me. Don't hide it. Don't disguise it. Just don't let what you cannot do interfere with what you can do. So I thought that quote was appropriate for today. And as I looked at that, I wanted to know from the collegiate level moving up, it's a bit more dicey when we talk about middle schoolers, high schoolers, and we'll get to there and refer to them a little bit. But the exemplars should come from those that those kids look at. They look at college kids. They look at professional players. And when those college kids go on the road in their given sport, here's what they have to say. When black athletes perform in white cities, the locker room is their safe space. So that tells you right there that a locker room racist doesn't have a chance to exist. It does, but it doesn't have a high chance to exist when the players of color are using that locker room space to be safe. So we're going to talk about identifying that safety as well as the things that threaten that safety. So we want to look at it from a real place, the environment that it's in, how and when should people be held accountable for it through the leadership that they represent. So just notice that that's real, environment, accountability, leadership, or real. Let's get real. That's old school phraseology too. Don't let the man talk to you. Let's get real. We were just talking off air before you guys came with us about our influences from the past. The past is a good reminder of what our future should look like and how we should make a change. That being said, let me give you this quote. Richard Sherman, who is now with the San Francisco 49ers, who has won a Super Bowl with the Seattle Seahawks, he says this, and by the way, a very well-respected individual in his own right, on and off the football field. He says this: you learn to at least respect your teammates regardless of race and come to have a genuine love and appreciation for your teammate, much different than society, where stereotypes dictate behavior. So that plays right to the safe space. So as the camaraderie of the team generates that kind of thought that Mr. Sherman talks about at the pro level, I'm hoping that mindset, that mindfulness, starts to leak into society. We replicate the locker room into the grocery store, the doctor's office, the pharmacy, hell, just walking down the street. Well, we've had a few little bumps in the road over time. It started back with a quarterback for the San Francisco 49ers who decided to kneel and share through that effort his disgust, his concern for social injustice. And he wanted to kneel in recognition of that at the national anthem at the beginning of each game that he played in. And that threw the rules to the wind for a lot of people. And one of them was Drew Brees of the New Orleans Saints. Well, his teammate Cameron Jordan said, look it, in our locker room, we hold people accountable. And he was public with that statement. He told the NFL media through their writer, Mike Silver, this is what we do. And I approached Drew Brees and said, you're wrong. You're just flat wrong. He went on to say that Drew Brees is beyond lost. Now, if that's not holding someone accountable, I don't know what is. And by the way, just a side note, you don't want to mess with Cameron Jordan. He's a big man. Despite the fact that our picture, for those who are watching us today, is with Cameron and his daughters, holding him in his arms. But this is a big man. He could be soft-spoken. He's carrying a really big stick. So says one of our Eisenhower's, Teddy Roosevelt. Teddy Roosevelt quote. But it was wrong, and he didn't understand the perspective of the player and players who have knelt. So as we look at that and we see that there are NFL players coming out and saying, look, our locker room is sacred ground. It's our place to develop our relationships, talk to each other, be clear, and hold each other accountable. We then have what's next, and that's coaches acknowledging racism, talking about racism publicly, but not with the same clarity and understanding. Heck, there are books written about this, about the white people. Don't be scared or concerned about what you owe humanity because of what history has done to people of this world, this globe. Just own your own space and get informed. Because he says this, I think our problems in the NFL along those lines, meaning racism, are minimal. No. NFL has their problems. This is Vic Fangio admitting that he's not quite clear as to what it looks like and where does it exist if it does. And the Broncos have had their own issues with bad behavior, not necessarily all of it being about racism. And they're not the only franchise that has that problem. So as we look to the heavens, as this picture indicates, and we're looking for guidance from somewhere. Why do we always look above? Can we look sideways? Couldn't it come from in front of me? I don't know. But anyway, may the force be with you from wherever it comes from so that you are framing, like I hope Coach Fangio might be listening, he might. Where do you find the answers? And get answers that you can trust from those that you can trust. We're going to be talking about this. We're going to delve into this and really start looking at those sources of trust. But ultimately, when we end it all up and you're walking down the road, it's all about you. As I tell my athletes, you have got to be self-aware at a depth intrinsically so that you are prepared to help others. If you don't take care of you first, you are not prepared to help anybody. So get the answers for you that fit and from sources you trust that are accurate. That when you hold somebody accountable, you don't have to rely on a 6'6" frame at 310 pounds like Cameron Jordan to influence what people hear and engage you with. Your words are the power. Your experience is the power. May the force be with you as you seek out your end in mind. Like I said earlier, as I opened this up, look, if you're a racist, and I believe there's racist behavior out there, and it ain't going to go away. They're just not going to change, and that's regretful. So just tell me. I want to begin with the end in mind. I want to know what the lay of the land looks like so I can make a path that fits who I am and how I can be my best so that I can then share that with others in a genuine, humble way without hesitation. That gives you a sense of where I want the show to end, that we hope we will give you outcomes that you'll take away that will define and clarify the ends in mind for you as it relates to racism in that metaphorical locker room, not just a sports locker room, but move it and share it in any space that you can as you discover your end in mind. So without any hesitation, let me bring in my guest today. That's Jeff Campbell, a.k.a. Jeff Alumbar. I'll let Jeff tackle that if he likes on the hidden stories that he has, the storyteller that he is, the wordsmither that he is, across genres of music and entertainment that only he will share with us at his desires. I'm really glad, gosh, Jeff, I'm so glad that we've got to this point. We started back in 2020. Pandemic has slowed us down, but I'm so glad you're here. Welcome to this morning to 360 Performance.
Thank you so much for having me, Coach. I really appreciate it. It's an honor to get a chance to talk with you.
So tell me, let's start off with the first question. I mean, you were gracious enough to really take time to think these through and share your responses, but I know we're gonna enlarge them and embellish them and make them bigger. What are some of the recommended strategies that you will offer to individuals to stop their racist behavior?
Well, thank you for that question. I think it's a difficult one to answer because racism itself lives in the land of denial. So in order to first, any sort of advice that I would give someone, it really begins with them admitting to or acknowledging that they have a bias. And first and foremost, understanding that bias and then moving along the continuum that deconstructs that bias, that where does, what are the origins of this bias, and to dispel myth from truth. When we talk about racism and it living in the land of denial, it exists in these myths that then foster a polarization of folks where people feel like they can other people or us against them or not us. We're this way and they're that way. So there's so much to dig through, and then once you get your head around that polarization, then you begin to look at the minimization of it all. We're all operating under the same laws. Well, don't break the law and you won't, get in trouble. Well, all lives matter. I don't know what the issue is. And once you get beyond that, you then begin to say, well, okay, hey, maybe there is a disparity. Maybe folks are treated differently, and then you feel powerless in the complete structure of our society to really do anything. And so stopping racist behavior takes you from that acceptance and into, an adaptation where you're no longer judging folks based on any, social or cultural judgment or, yardstick that you judge yourself on or that you judge other people that okay, folks who are Muslim wear, their clothes in this certain way, and that doesn't necessarily mean that they are wrong or bad or whatever. It just is what it is, and the only thing that I can judge is that maybe it might be a little bit hotter underneath all of that, but other than that, it is what it is, and that's who they are. And so once you finally get to that point, you're on to something, but there's so much that it's been reinforced over years and years and years within our culture and within our society that, just to getting to that point to say, hey, I may need to look at the fact that I have a bias.
You've opened up with a great salvo of things to dissect. Let me bring it back to the locker room with a simple example to many of the points you made about staying in the moment, controlling what you can control, and yet knowing there's a whole bunch of stuff swirling around that one moment. And for me, a few years ago, with a college football team, it was about a coach saying that he couldn't understand why these players are so ignorant about the schedule and being prepared for practice and what's going on with them. And then, there's a couple references to racial, where they come from, their neighborhood, their high school education, any number of different things that pop up. And I said, hold on a second. Let's take a look at the locker room for a minute and see where you post the schedule for practice. Well, the schedule was posted on a bulletin board that seemed to be properly located in front of lockers that were predominantly for the higher skilled or more skill influenced positions, like quarterbacks and cornerbacks and running backs and wide receivers. And all the other offensive line, defensive line, they were in another part of the locker room, a distance away from the bulletin board. So when they came in, heading for their locker, they didn't see the board. I said, let's assume none of what you said about the descriptors you used for the players, and let's just look at it practically about the delivery of the message, systemically. So I got them to move because it wasn't racial. It didn't throw up any stirring of the pot. I said, let's move the schedule in front of the main door of the locker room, put up a brand new bulletin board so everybody has to see it if they choose. It's there, so they got to still look at it. Well, guess what? The approved performance of being accountable was amazing. And the coaches were, oh my God, I'm glad you're here. I said, no. I want no props for this. I want you to understand you need to be accountable and responsible for setting up things that considers the player and who they are. So as a person who speaks words, Jeff, to people, what is about the communication and the style of communication that we need to get better at? Just to get people out of their ignorance about racist behavior that they don't even know it's racist behavior. I mean, their biases are generated out of bad communication or the lack thereof.
Not only bad communication, and definitely staying in the dialogue is the action, because the topic is so intense that folks, normally want to unplug, normally don't want to go there, and certainly don't want to be held accountable for something that they don't necessarily feel they're responsible for. So in that sense, it goes beyond the communication, because there is education, there is rooted in the system of our country is the bias. The bias is deeply rooted in our, history, in the way that we teach history to young people from the very beginning. So by the time folks are adults and they are interacting with others, and they have taken this indoctrination, conditioning, and programming over all their years of rearing, by the time they're interacting with people who look different from them, that they've only read certain things about them in history, or only seen certain images of them through the media, then of course they say, well, how come these lazy, no concept of time folks can't get to practice on time? Because if they were educated, they would certainly take this with far more responsibility. So yes, coming to the table, once you get beyond denial, once you cross that property line of the land of denial, then yes, you got to stay in the dialogue. You got to stay in the conversation, because that's where you'll get to the point of adaptation. That's where you'll get to the point where your emancipation is tied to my emancipation, to where your humanity is tied to my humanity. You can't get there anywhere else than through that communication, through that dialogue, and staying in the dialogue is essential to that growth. And I'm glad that you were there and that you were present to say, hey, let's just look at this from an ergonomic contextual framework, and let's put things, let's get the feng shui in here going right in this locker room, so that people can see and be aware of where things are. I know that coming out of practice and taking your helmet off and taking off your shoulder pads and just wanting to get in the shower and stuff, I could see how you could miss the bulletin board or the dry erase board of when practice is, or I could see how difficult that could be. So I'm glad that you were there to just say, hey, let's take a different perspective, let's take a different approach. So
well, let's take a look at the extension of that into the education presumptions. Kids come in from different parts of the country to a place they've never been to before in their life, because they didn't travel a lot. They didn't have the means to travel. So they get drawn to this part of the country, a mountain state from a sea level state, and it's brand new. And sometimes it's exciting, but the coaches are only looking at the physicality of it. Great physical specimen. We need that physicality. They have the cornerback body type. A body type and next man up are two phrases I just despise, because I was a short guy who was 6'5" in my mind and wanted, and I had the desire. Let me go get it. So I talk to coaches about this all the time, about don't be presumptive. If you closed your eyes and listened to the kid talk about their desire of the sport, would you know the color of their skin? Would you really, truly understand who they are if your eyes were closed? You'd never seen them before. And all you knew was what their desire for the sport is and how they performed it. Let's do that. Let's do an eyes closed evaluation. And here's another example in the locker room to that racist behavior that many people don't understand. There's a big basket on rollers in locker rooms to gather all of the gear. Shorts, t-shirts, socks, jerseys, to go put them in the wash, right? And it's right there, right outside the equipment room, on their way to the shower. Well, the basket is probably 2 foot by 4 foot rectangle. It's a big target. Can you guess how much of the stuff gets in that target? Yet it's around the floor. And I actually lit up somebody, an assistant coach, about their remark about who the culprits were in dropping their stuff on the floor, not being responsible. People who don't live that life at their home. People from a poor background. And I didn't even bother going to color. I just said, look at who just came in behind us. Do you see what he just did on his way to the shower? And where in the hell do you think he's from? And we both knew where he was from.
Right.
And it was an affluent family and town and all the opposite of what we were. I went, you got to open your eyes, kid. You just got to open your eyes. The bias it's loud. It's deafening, the bias. So I guess I got excited. I got to take a breath. My blood pressure, it's extraordinary.
All right.
So that goes to my next question then about the stressors. How and where is racist behavior that's not checked stressful to those who are receiving the impact of it? Is it stressful?
Well, we could talk about, implicit.
Yeah.
And we can talk about explicit.
Yeah.
But is unchecked racism, is it stressful? Yes, and checked racism, quite frankly, is stressful. When I think about it like this, like a house. In our society, like a house. And the house is built on an uneven foundation. And the general contractor and the architect and the subcontractors and the super, everybody knows that the house was built on an uneven foundation. But they sell it to you anyway, and they don't say anything about the uneven foundation. The uneven foundation is the bias. And so what happens over a period of time? Well, the floor cracks. And once the floor is cracked, then the walls begin to crack. And once the walls crack, then the windows don't open all the way. And then the door doesn't close right. So you can't close the door to the past. The windows of opportunity don't open all the way up. And the cracks in the floor, then lead to, infrastructural problems with your plumbing and your HVAC, the air, doesn't flow properly. So you look at these problems, and what do you try to do? You throw money at it? You cover it up with carpet? You threw a throw rug over that crack in the floor? You put some wallpaper or some beautiful pictures, the artwork up to hide those cracks in the walls? But the house is still damaged. The house is still damaged. So you get to a point where you're like, okay, I need to either repair this or move out. Or move.
I've got tingles here because you just wrote the lyrics to a song. I'm so glad we recorded this because you just wrote the lyrics to a song. Because that's exactly what people have felt and done for years. If they're not looking at themselves, who are listening to this and are looking at their house or thinking about their own personality and what they've gone through and said, you know what, I did. I threw a cape over this. I put a hat on. I threw a rug down on the floor. Yep, I can be culpable for that, and I shouldn't be. And God forbid it's in a profession. It's a police officer. It's a firefighter. It's a nurse. It's an executive. It's a teacher that are doing that, just to get through the lesson plan or just to get through the day, and hope to God they don't have to go into a certain neighborhood. I'm reminded by history through your example of the Tulsa riots. It wasn't the Tulsa riots. But Tulsa was that same thing. They didn't want to go there and look at what prosperity looked like in a group that they had disdain for. And when they then had to be it was put in their face because their success was getting so great, they had to make up excuses. They had to put a rug over it. In this case, they lit a fire. And that was regretful. What's nice to know, though, is that Wikipedia made the effort to change the record on their site and said it was the Tulsa Massacre and added historical references to adjust to that. Now, that is not necessarily a story about racism, but it's about what started it is racist. The fear, the unknown, the biases. Because fear is in extreme, bias is a degree below, but they all lead to one another in getting it to that place. And that leads me to this quote before I ask you my next question. And this quote comes from an NFL player that talks to what you just said. The locker room is different from society in that we are able to have conversations out of place of respect more times than not, because the stereotypes of society have usually been removed in the locker room, or they've been faded by the time people get into the NFL. Now, to me, that's a subtle reference that we don't bother training anybody. Like in rookie camp that's coming up in a few weeks, they're not talking to them about how do you identify racist behavior, how do you call it out, how do you send your remarks about accountability to anybody that's doing those things. we need to get to that next step. So I appreciate this quote that there is a societal difference in perception versus the locker room, but I don't give it full weight. The locker room in sports is still a place for racism to raise its ugly head, but I think more often than not, it's a greater opportunity to train those who are unfamiliar with the signs, have bias. And by the way, I have found both the white person and the people of color who have biases. I have examples of that too. But I wanted to ask you this question then. How does a sports locker room racism promote, because these guys are talking about subtleties. They say it's not quite the same, if at all, in the locker room. But I think there's demeaning behavior that goes on that isn't necessarily, it's more like camouflage. Yeah, we call each other names. We use racial, phrases, or racially sensitive phrases that are demeaning. But it's in the locker room. We all get along and we laugh about it and we move on. And I had a pro baseball player, colleague of mine, say exactly the same thing about, and he referenced Hispanic ball players as well as the African American ball players. And I said to him, are you kidding me? Really? Everybody in that locker room thought it was okay and giggled. I don't believe you. And he said, well, that's my experience. I said, well, please talk to your colleagues and ask them what their experience was, so we can both agree or disagree. So I ask you the same question. How does sports locker room racism promote demeaning behavior?
Well, first, I want to say that in the sports dynamic, there is the locker room, and that in the locker room there is an opportunity for camaraderie. There's an opportunity for team building. There's an opportunity for trust building. There's an opportunity for sharing with one another, teammate to teammate, in powerful ways. And tough talk or banter. Our former president of the United States, had a phrase that he used called locker room talk in reference to misogynist rhetoric that he espoused. And women have often talked about this concept called toxic masculinity that a lot of men really seem to have a problem with. And they can't just be quiet and listen to the experience of women and their perspective. So I think the same goes for race, but it's different because we're talking about the same gender. Usually we're talking about men trash talking and exchanging banter one another is a large part of who we are as men. In this society, you're taught to be tough. You're taught not to express your emotions, not to complain, not to tattletale, not to, you're not, you're told that you're less of a man if you express your emotions in a way that you expose your sensitivity.
Feminize your behavior.
Yeah. You can't expose your sensitivity. So going back and forth and trash talking to each other, and then we say that it's fine. But what this perpetuates, let's talk about Cassius Clay and how hard it was for him to just change his name, and what were the results and the aftermath of him changing his name. We could talk about, again, Colin Kaepernick, which you referenced earlier, and Denver folks, you know, lest we forget Mahmoud Abdul Rauf.
Yeah, yeah.
So when we talk about racism and racist banter in the locker room, and then excusing it away as just quote unquote locker room talk, and that's just how we do to each other, and it's fine and it's no big deal. Where is the line, and where does it end? And it's awfully hard to draw a line of where things end if you give it agency and to exist in certain places. This is why a lot of folks lately have been striking out against comedians.
Yeah.
Comedians have pushed back. Comedians are like, this is my space to be a complete jackass, and it's just all in fun, and you are simply just to take it for what it is. I am here to say what is not allowed to be said. And then once that's done, these are just jokes, and once that's done, you go back into society. You don't repeat these jokes. You go to the water cooler.
Yeah.
You don't repeat these jokes. And so folks are battling with these norms that have just, gone on for so long. And so the locker room can be, it's going to give birth to what comes out onto that field. The locker room is like the womb. And when everything is done in the locker room, and the pep talk is done in the locker room, and we're dressed and we're ready to play, then we go out and we give birth to, what will be on that field. And
you allow me an opportunity to segue to an example of the Los Angeles Dodgers during the World Series with the Houston Astros, and I happened to be on that field at that very, not on the field literally, but my players were with the Dodgers, and the pitcher on the mound was of Asian descent.
Yeah.
And remarks were made in Spanish from the Houston dugout that were racially demeaning. He weaponized what he knew about that player and used it as a strategy, which it worked. Legit, it worked. Got in his head, and as a result, and that was the same. By the way, that was the same series that Houston was accused of the videotaping from center field. That was the same World Series that they got tagged for that. So bad behavior begats bad behavior. So my question for you with what you've just said in that example is, can we provide visual triggers as reminders of the behavior that is essential and foundational to being aware of ethnicity, being aware of people's differences, and not marginalizing them, but appreciating them and honoring them in some way, and yet still be competitive, still come out and get excited about that Asian descent pitcher, and I'm gonna take his skill and match my skill. I'm gonna put it out of the park. I don't have to resort to language to get in his head that's racist. And at the same time, Houston's leadership in the front office said nothing about that incident until LA started getting a little bit legal with them. It doesn't need to come to that. We need to train that behavior. So what do you think about banners, posters, wordsmithing, some kind of language and phraseologies we can offer to coaches and players as triggers that remind them of their responsibility?
Well, I think, banners and things like that are great, but this is really why I do storytelling.
There you go. Yep.
This is really it. This is because I believe that storytelling amplifies us, the us. And when it amplifies us, it turns the volume down on the so-called not us.
The them, yeah.
It hits the mute button on the us against them. And it just pulls the plug right out of the socket of the so-called other. When you hear a person's story, you can't deny it. And I would venture to believe that that Asian pitcher has a fascinating, compelling, and beautiful story that got him on that mound.
Yep.
Just as any other athlete. But I want to tell you, like, I grew up in a town, very homogenous town, Longmont, Colorado.
No way.
And we played football. I played for Skyline High School.
I know the school.
And I was a fly in the buttermilk. I was the only black player on the team at the time. And the coach from across the town at Longmont High School, when they were in the playoffs for the state championship, and they were playing a team, I believe the team was out of Thornton, they would scout the team like good coaches do, and then they would during practice they would run the plays, they would run the offense of that team. So Coach Gordon, I believe he was, at Longmont. So the running backs of that Thornton team were black. So Coach Gordon thought it was appropriate to paint his players' faces black, to do blackface on the players that were running the plays of the Thornton team. And I had heard this, and other students had told me this, and I was a young kid and just didn't really, understand the gravitas of that sort of behavior. But I'm going to tell you, I remember it to this day. I'm 51 years old. I remember that to this day. And so, and I'll go one further. I played in West Side Story over at Skyline. We, in the theater program, I was in West Side Story. And the drama teacher painted the guys who played the Sharks, they painted their faces brown. And this is high school, and nobody said anything. They didn't paint my face brown, but I played Chino. I was the one that shot Tony. I was give him the gun. So it's like,
were you militant? You weren't a militant, were you?
Not then. But then looking back at all of these things that happened, I didn't understand how much they would still affect my decision making and my choices of who I am to this day. When I heard about the Starbucks incident, when those two brothers went into Starbucks and they didn't want to buy nothing, they were just waiting on their friend, and the woman behind the counter called the police and had them arrested. My mind, because white supremacy and racism is so embedded in my mind, I was like, why didn't y'all just buy something? and my thing was like, I know better than to go into Starbucks and sit down and not buy something. That's what was going on in my head. Not that, hey, that's not freedom. Hey, she wouldn't have acted like that elsewhere. That's not where my mind went. My mind went, buy something, protect yourself. So these things have resonance and they last a lifetime.
So Jeff, what do we do? What do we do then with those moments like you've experienced, and those young men who stood their ground and got arrested? To me, those are MLK moments. Those are moments that people gather together, lock arms at the counter, and say, enough is enough. Do we have the courage to do that? Do we have the education to give them the confidence and understanding yet? I believe we have a ways to go.
We certainly do, but that's the power of storytelling.
Okay.
Storytelling is the gateway drug to empathy.
Excellent.
And once you get a hit of it, boy, you just can't quit.
Well, let me take a moment here to make sure everybody understands that that Jeffrey Campbell is not only a storyteller, but he's a spoken word artist and arts educator, been around a while, was gracious enough to tell us and admit it on air that he's 51 years old. I thought that took a lot of courage to do that. No, I'm just kidding. But he's had experiences across the gambit of emotions, working with veterans and PTSD issues, dealing with neighborhoods and Emancipation Theater, which is one of his more current projects. I think it's worthwhile to know that he's got, as he's already shown us, a plethora of experiences that relates him directly into the proposition that we've introduced to you today about locker room racist. What is it? Where is it? Who is it? And how do we really make a purposeful attempt at educating it, making it real in an environment that requires good leadership? So Jeff, I want to ask you another question related to what you just said about the context of your experience as a young athlete and all those memories flooding back to you and staying with you. What about your behavior today has been enhanced because of those experiences? I mean, you mentioned storytelling and all those great things that you've done, but are there any specific things that you make sure you do on a daily and weekly basis that are driven by those experiences?
Well, I think it's just having context. I've just grown to understand, the world that I live in, and being able to have context, and just understanding, what I'm dealing with is probably the most powerful thing for me. But also, the things that have compelled me to do the work that I do. I've also, I don't want to paint this somber picture that I've just had this horrible life where I've never had any beautiful experiences of humanity, of compassion, kindness from people who don't look like me. Because I certainly have. However, it is always important to stand up and to educate others. When George Floyd was murdered and the country reacted, growing up in this homogenous town, folks contacted me, wanted to reach out to ask me how I was feeling. People I ain't talked to since middle school. And I'm going to tell you, Lowell, it upset me. Why are you calling me now? Why, why do you think that I really even want to hear from you? And a lot of it felt to me like they wanted me to validate their racism or make them feel like I'm okay because, I know Jeff and Jeff thinks I'm all right, therefore I'm not racist. And folks the question kept saying, what can I do? What can we do? What can we do? And I was faced with, I'm in the middle of COVID. My job building custom closets is come to a close. I'm looking, I've got this tiny investment from my father to build Emancipation Theater. What do I do? And I recognized, after I got upset, I recognized that folks, particularly white folks, were looking for guidance, direction, and leadership of how to engage in the civic process, how to engage in this very dialogue that we're talking about staying in the dialogue. And so at that point I said, okay, you want to know what you can do? And I started this project under Emancipation Theater called From Allies to Abolitionists. We abuse this word allyship and allies, but you know what? The Kurds were our allies against ISIS in Syria. And what happened to them when Turkey decided that they wanted that part of Syria? Okay, so that peripheral relationship that we had with them went away. It's the same thing as when that athlete gets the call and gets into the league and he has this relationship with the league, and then during practice his knee blows out and all is lost. So that peripheral relationship, is that allyship to me. So I wanted to say, from allies to abolitionists, you've got to disrupt. You've got to get in the way. You've got to stay in this dialogue and shut down the bias wherever you see it. You have to repair the house. And when you repair the house that is on an uneven foundation, you don't lower the side that is higher. You raise the side that is lower. And so that is how I've responded. And I think that's how you respond, is you engage in the dialogue. And, that's why storytelling is so powerful.
Jeff, with that disruptor remark you made in telling those stories, you also use some words that I'll equate to influencers. You disrupt, you get involved, you push, but at some point in that pushing, you realize the lower floor has been leveled up. So now is that the point where I'm an influencer and I want to take it to the next level and educate because I've got the opportunity. I've got them here listening to me. Because I believe that disruptors always have an influencer around, or if there's an influencer, at some point you're going to have to disrupt again because things will shift and change. So where does the influencer fit into your model on emancipation and abolishment?
Yeah, I mean, you hit the nail on the head. I mean, that's me. I have been blessed to be able to, have a full-time job, self-employed, as a storyteller, as a theater writer, playwright, and producer. And even in the virtual space, we've been able to still stay afloat producing. So we just recently produced with the Tattered Cover, a virtual production of A Raisin in the Sun. So having that influence and having a audience, a following that responds to the products that I put out there, I absolutely have a responsibility to continue to inspire action so folks can stay in the dialogue. We have groups of volunteers who show up weekly, not monthly, but weekly, to city council, public comment, to engage in the dialogue, to stay in the civic process. We just put together a documentary film entitled Message to the Mayor, where we spoke directly to the mayor and city government in regards to the traumatic displacement of people experiencing homelessness in the middle of COVID, where the encampments are swept and folks are not given any alternatives to shelter. And their blankets and their sleeping bags and their tarps and their tents are taken away by city government. And they're basically left to be susceptible to the elements. And many have died from hypothermia. So you just have to stay in the dialogue. And once you are there, you will recognize that your power is sufficient and you've got far more influence than you knew that you had. And the more we continue to do this, the more we recognize that everywhere we look, there's a bias, and we have the ability to get in the way and obstruct that bias and stand for truth and stand for equity and justice.
Well, and I'm gonna, first of all, thank you for that wonderful segue, because you read the rhythms pretty well. We're getting close to our end of the show. We've got about 4.5 minutes left, and I want to piggyback what you just said and bring this to the table for our listeners and for use in the future about bias. in the world of woodworking or construction of a home, bias is both a positive and a negative. And when a carpenter or an architect sees bias, it's many times a creative place in the design and construction of that piece. So I want to make sure that we don't lose that posturing of bias is being fully aware of what bias is approaching you, so that the standards of behavior, to your example about the homeless people that got swept out, there was a bias there. It wasn't a negative bias. It was the bias of weather and homelessness that they had to deal with. They were dealing with it. So the standards of the city should have been to address the bias, not remove it, supplement it, augment it, alter it in some way, that you don't lose the premise of the people and what they're trying to do. So with the metaphor of the locker room, Jeffrey, I want to make sure that we look at the locker room as a metaphor of bias. It has cultural blending and diversity in it that needs to be appreciated. Coaches are getting better at it, but I also want us to move away from here with a takeaway that says the locker room is a metaphor for others in whatever space they have to deal with the biases and the unknowns that they need to be aware of. The other piece is, in real terms, a locker room could be the wonderful center of knowledge for young people to understand what their next step is in working with differentiated and marginalized communities. I hope that is a takeaway for everybody. In the last couple of minutes, Jeffrey, share with our audience what you want them to take away from today's discussion.
Thank you. And again, I just want to say, Lowell, thank you so much for the opportunity to share a little bit of time with you and to have this discussion. This discussion is important, and it just has to continue. Ultimately, I want to leave with everybody is that, the locker room is a great opportunity for us to team build, to trust build, to share our stories, to recognize our differences, and to recognize that everybody brings something special to the table. That pulling guard is a leader. Whether the quarterback is the coach is the leader at the beginning, but then as soon as that quarterback recognizes does not recognize that defense, hey, he has to make a call. So he calls an audible. And that pulling guard that's coming around that end, and catches that cornerback off, and knocks him off his rocker so that fullback can do what he's got to do to get that first down. Everybody's a leader. Everybody has something valuable to bring to the table. So recognize the leadership in everybody and recognize everybody's value.
Thank you, Jeffrey. I want to let everybody know that next week we're going to have Nikki Burnett with us. We're going to talk about nutritional components that address inflammation. You can about imagine how much inflammation we've had in the last year and a half just in dealing with our pandemic. But this is about those performance inflammations, bumps and bruises. We've got a lot of preseason activity going on, and I want to make sure that Nikki Burnett joins me with her insights on inflammation and how nutrition addresses that. Everybody have a great weekend. Be safe, and be an influencer that demands something that is disturbing to someone else. Have a great day today. Thanks a lot.